Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I want to say tonight's video features creepypastas. These stories aren't true, but they are truly terrifying. That being said, don't jump ship just yet. They are extremely good stories. I really am trying to provide you with the best. I think you'll really enjoy them. So please give them a chance. And also, I'd like to introduce you to our collaborator for tonight, Papa Scare. He really is fantastic. You really do need to check out his content when you're done. Please subscribe to his channel too, as he really does deserve your support. But with that being said, stay comfortable and let the darkness take control. Either you have a soul or you don't. It's the same to me either way. If there is no soul, then a human corpse is no more sacred than ground beef in the grocery store or roadkill smushed into the asphalt. If you do have a soul, then it's already gone by the time you close your eyes for the last time. Either way, the body left behind no longer belongs to you. Now, some might protest and say that a person is the owner of their own body, so once they die, their body is inherited by their family, along with the rest of their possessions. If this were true, then anyone would be free to take that body home with them. Maybe they'd prop it up in an armchair, keep it in the freezer until the weather's nice enough to bring along onto the next family fishing trip. If anyone tried to do this, their next family gathering would doubtlessly be interrupted by the police, who would be quickly convinced that the body is not your property to do with what you like. That in reality, your body belongs to the state, and that it's up to them to decide your ultimate fate. In other words, no, I don't feel bad about stealing bodies from this state who has no right to them in the first place. I work in a mortuary, you see, but I'm not going to tell you which, because that would be bad for business. The first body I took was destined for a closed casket funeral. She hadn't been wearing a seatbelt during a car accident, and the force of the impact from her face hitting the windshield made her skull completely flat, as if someone had taken a hammer to Play-Doh. I commented on the incident at the time to a friend, a male nurse who worked at a nearby teaching hospital, and offered me $500 on the spot so he and his friends could have some extra autopsy practice. And I couldn't think of any justification to say no. The reasoning was straightforward enough. He and his friends would benefit from the extra experience, and that experience would then benefit other people during their medical careers. And of course I would benefit from the extra cash. Meanwhile, the corpse certainly wasn't going to mind, and the family was never going to find out. So a strictly ultimatarian philosophy dictated that it was the right thing to do. The woman weighed about 126 pounds at the time of her end, exactly the same as 28 bricks which I lined the bottom of her casket with. The funeral went as funerals do, with tears and speeches and many furtive glances at the clock hanging at the back of the church. It wouldn't have even been worth mentioning it to the woman's father, hadn't he made the selfish request to see his daughter one last time. I possessed a good deal of confidence in my ability to be persuasive, added by the air of authority I've cultivated in being a medical professional. Somehow I doubted that I could conjure any medical terminology of sufficient verbosity to convince the man that the accident had condensed his daughter into a pile of bricks, though. Instead, I was forced to rush from one member of the family to the next, convincing each in turn that seeing the corpse would instill a traumatic memory in them that would forever taint their recollection of the deceased. Once I had sufficient support for the idea, we all descended upon the father in a flurry of pleading for him to forego the request. It was a weight off my heart when he finally accepted and withdrew his intention. As you can imagine, I learnt my lesson after that. I would never again let myself be put in that untenable position. From then on, I would only sell corpses of those destined for cremation instead. It's not like I had much choice in the matter anyway. It turns out that Wagner, one of my friend's colleagues who participated in the unsanctioned autopsy wasn't satisfied with a single body. No. Not only would Wagner require a steady stream of them, but he even threatened to report me to the authorities if I did not provide. If we were the only ones who paid the price, I might have fought back, but then Wagner went on to say he would tell the family of the deceased. I couldn't bear the thought of how they would react, particularly the father, who had wanted to see his daughter again. 1 body a month, that's what he wanted to purchase, an insignificant number compared with the volume of business my mortuary processed. It wasn't difficult at all to move the covered bodies into the back of the van, nor was it hard to disguise the incinerated remains. Everything looks pretty much the same after it's been blasted with 1,800 degrees in the cremation oven for a few hours. Perhaps simply working with corpses all day has desensitized me somewhat, but it didn't take me long before these monthly transactions had become a regular part of my business. It's not like I was in it for the money either. I'd actually been donating all the money I get to help the families with their funeral costs. One time I was already waiting for him by the back door with the body ready to go. He took one peek under the cloth, turned up his nose and said, "I don't like that one. What else you got?" "What's not to like?" I asked. I grasped hold of the deceased man's fat belly and shook it with both hands. He's jammed full of lovely organs to play with. "We're studying the removal of ovarian cysts," Wagner told me. "I only want females from now on. The younger, the better." It just so happened that I had a girl in her mid-20s scheduled to be cremated and saw no difference in making the switch. This continued for another 4 months before I had a chance to catch up with my friend again over coffee, and he was shocked to hear that Wagner still wanted bodies at all. "Didn't Wagner tell you that he dropped out of medical school last semester?" my friend asked me. "No, he never mentioned that." "What was he using the bodies for then?" he asked. And as we stared at each other over our coffees, the unsettling possibilities began to float up from those dark places in the mind we tried to forget are there at all. "Well, it could be worse," my friend said after a long pause. Then another as he took a sip of his coffee. "At least he isn't hurting anyone." "You don't think he's..." "Wagner's always been a weird dude. What's wrong with it though?" my friend asked, nonplussed. "It's not like doing it with a kid or animal or anything. It's not like anyone is suffering." "We have to tell someone, don't we?" I asked, not sure what I was hoping to hear. My friend shrugged. "Telling someone would only hurt people. Not telling would not. Besides, I heard Wagner used to have a girlfriend, but it ended badly. So she got roughed up and the police had to get involved. To this day he swears she's the one who started it, and he was only defending himself. But she was like a foot shorter than him and half his weight, so none of us really believed it. So you're really doing the community a service by keeping him away from living girls." "But why would he need a new one every month?" I asked. "Why do you care? It's not like the other girls are going to get jealous. Anyway, he's had enough medical training to know how to preserve them all properly. It's not like it's going to be a health issue." Shortly later, my friend got a call and had to get back to work. I kept sitting there for about an hour not drinking my coffee, just thinking while trying to not visualize anything too clearly. I know it's wrong, but for the life of me I can't figure out why. Of course my instincts revolt at the idea, but doesn't being offended make it wrong? After all, humans have a long history of being offended by everything from scientific knowledge to using birth control or even eating the wrong kinds of meat on the wrong kind of day, and none of that hurt people either. And even if the offensive thought itself is the sin, then the only way the families would suffer is if I stopped providing the bodies, and Wagner followed through on his threats to tell them. Not to mention that I wouldn't be able to donate the funeral expenses anymore. So that's why I'm sharing this. I wanted to ask your opinion. Should I cut off Wagner, or let him have his fun?
I dread looking at mirrors. I can't bear the thought of looking at my own reflection anymore. There's nothing wrong with my reflection. I've looked the same as I did before the incident. A couple of lines around my eyes that I could have done without. Hair graying a little at the temples. But it isn't my face looking back at me. There's something wrong. A stranger looks back with my face, like a marionette with my features. It moves when I want it to move. I smile, it smiles. I frown, it frowns. But it isn't me. My shrink can't explain this fear. My wife can't explain it. I can. I know exactly when everything changed. I've never told them about the incident in the elevator. I don't think I ever will. Not after what happened to our daughter. Have you ever had that one day you can remember with absolute clarity? The one that you can pause, rewind in your mind like a DVD. This is mine. This was a month ago. I had a meeting, a last-minute thing. We started at 5 p.m. on a Friday. The building was one of those behemoths of glass and steel that peppered the skyline in the late 2000s. It was late when I was done. My colleagues shuffled papers across the table and back into leather briefcases. Our counterparts were across a long table, sharing a whispered conversation about next steps and strategies. Jessica and Brian, my two colleagues, left first. It was a Friday night, and their friends were probably already getting the first drinks of the evening. I remember smiling ruefully at their youthful energy as they left the room. The snap of the clasps on my own briefcase followed, and my fingers settled into familiar grooves in the dark leather. I paid a visit to the washroom before I left. It was already dark outside and the office was empty. Half the lights were off to save power. The maze of cubicles basked in a fluorescent twilight. The only sounds on the floor came from the meeting room, and even those receded into the distance as I walked to the elevators, leaving me with only the sound of the rasp of the vents for company. Some disturbed interior designer had fitted mirrors on all 4 walls of the elevator. When I was riding up with a full cabin, it felt like being in a sea of people, a slightly nauseating feeling. Riding the elevator alone down 14 floors was a wholly different experience. I stared into the eyes of a row of reflections, staring back into infinity. The feeling disorientated me, and I felt my knees wobble as a wave of vertigo overcame me. I tore my gaze away and focused on the slow countdown as the elevator approached the ground floor. A single drop of sweat made its way down my brow. I loosened my shirt collar, chastising myself for the irrationality of my reaction, just as the elevator jerked to a stop. The sudden stop made my knees buckle, and I stumbled from one wall to another for one maddening moment as the lights in the elevator flickered and went out completely. The last image seared into my mind was an army of reflections of myself swaying and staggering. Or not all of them. I swear that amongst the hundreds of figures, I saw in the half-light one that was standing absolutely still. The small space echoed with the harsh rasp of my own breathing, and the pounding of my heartbeat filled my ears. I fumbled through my pocket. I held my phone in front of me like a talisman against the darkness. My thumb was poised, white-knuckled, above the power button. I couldn't bring myself to summon the ounces of pressure it would take to light the elevator up, for fear of what the light would reveal. Just as the mirrors converted the tiny elevator into a vast plane, the darkness stretched those scant minutes into an eternity. I jumped as the intercom crackled to life. Sir? We seem to have lost power in the building for a while. We've got someone down at the power room now. We'll be back online in no time. My voice was very loud in the tiny space, deafening even. Just let us out, please. Okay, we got it. Think something must have tripped the power, the guard said, after a brief pause. There was a hiss of escaping air as the lift door opened into the pitch darkness of another office floor. The lights in the elevator winked back on. After I blinked the harsh light from my eyes, I found myself face to face with my own terrified visage, reflected over and over again. except for one thing. There was a gap in the row of reflections. One of them was missing. One more thing haunted me as the lift made its way to the ground floor, and I left the building, the cold sweat drying on my skin as I sped through the car park with the windows down. All the time I was in the elevator, I hadn't said a single word. Not a single word. After my experience with the elevator ride, I began to have problems with mirrors. Not big problems at first. I found myself staring at my reflection more and more. It started out as a vaguely unsettling feeling, as if something was incomplete. Like when you've missed a button on a shirt and you keep on staring to figure out what's wrong. I didn't get the same feeling from photographs, only mirrors. It got worse. I started prodding and pinching my face to convince myself that it was really me looking back from the glass. It was only after I had raked a shallow scratch from my cheekbone to my chin that I began avoiding mirrors altogether. Stacy's own fascination with mirrors started growing at the same time as my own fear. Funny that she hates mirrors just as much as I do after the incident. Stacy is 7. I'll be damned if you can't find a father that doesn't describe a daughter at that age as perfect. Well, she's got it all. The strawberry blonde hair, the freckles, the look of wonder all the time because the entire world is so new. It started small. Julie, my wife, started complaining about having to clean all the mirrors in the house so much more. Fingerprints for the most part. Sometimes a smudge where Stacy had pressed her face up to the mirror. It really didn't click for me at the time, especially with the twin stresses of work and the insidious thought that I was somehow going insane. It wasn't just at home either. Julie would find her staring intently at mirrored surfaces in malls, the car window, everywhere. Then the talking started. It wasn't uncommon to hear Stacy talking or singing to herself. That's what kids do, right? Something was different here. Julie couldn't put her finger on it. The tones and inflections were different from the sing-song manner that girls used when they were talking to dolls. Far too serious. This was a conversation between equals. She'd catch snatches of one-sided conversations from the hallway, only to find Stacy alone in the room, looking at her reflection in the big mirror in her bedroom. Stacy would give her one of those petulant looks that only a 7-year-old can summon up, like she'd interrupted something private or pointed out that Santa Claus wasn't real. Julie put it down to Stacy making up another imaginary friend for herself, something that lived in the mirror. Julie confronted me one night after I got in late from work. "You should really spend more time with her, you know. She really misses our dinners together. Or when you used to take the time to fetch her from school," Julie said. I can't remember what I said in response. I imagined that it was one of those filler sentences that punctuate the spaces in a marriage, like packing material or bubble wrap. "Well, I think she really misses you. You know she's got that whole imaginary friend thing going on, right?" I nodded in response. "Well, I think she imagines she's talking to you. I found her writing all over the big mirror with a Sharpie, backwards. She said it was so that it would be read from the other side of the window, or so she called it. So I explained to her that mirrors showed people things that are in front of them, while windows showed people things that are behind them. I didn't think she'd still be confused about these things at her age, honestly. Do you know what she told me? She said, Daddy wasn't behind me, but he was in the glass. So it must be a window, right? Such an imagination. Anyway, the Sharpie dried out on the mirror, so could you go clean it off with some of that solvent stuff you keep in the garage? My mouth went dry. She had to repeat her last sentence twice before I grunted an acknowledgement. It was a struggle to put one foot in front of the other, dreading what I would find at the end of the long hallway to my bedroom. I chided myself on the sheer absurdity of the situation. A grown man terrified in his own home because of his daughter's imaginary friend. There were no boogeymen or doppelgangers in the bedroom, only the simple sight of a cheap full-length mirror from IKEA, wheeled to the center of the room. It took me a while to read the reversed writing on the glass. "Why can't you come out and play with me?" it said. I rubbed the hateful words with my hand. They wouldn't come off. Stacy had left a collection of handprints halfway down the mirror as well, probably indulging her newfound habit of touching mirrors. Temporarily defeated by the ink marks, I turned my attention to the handprints. I took the corner of my sleeve to the glass and started wiping them away. Something wasn't right. I couldn't seem to clean off all the smudges. I shook uncontrollably as I realized what the remaining smudge was. A single, large handprint. I could barely keep my own hand still enough to place it over the handprint. A perfect match. I pushed my face closer to the glass and finally saw it. The reason why I couldn't wipe off the handprint. 1/5 of an inch of space between the smudge and my fingers on the glass. The print was on the inside of the glass. The world swam as my gorge rose, hot and sour in the back of my throat. I barely made it to the toilet in time. Half a world away, my wife's concerned voice was asking if I was alright. The blood was still pounding in my ears as I splashed cool water onto my face. I looked up into the bathroom mirror. I found myself face to face with a ghastly caricature of myself. Eyes wild, hair disheveled and grinning like a maniac. I touched one trembling hand to my face to be sure I wasn't smiling. It took the doctor an hour and 26 stitches to close the cuts on my knuckles. This part of the story is by far the hardest to relive and even harder to pen down. But I remember it vividly, just like I remember the elevator ride. The memory stalks my dreams at night. In the day, in the little quiet moments, the pauses between events, I pick at it in my mind, like a never-healing scab. The pain I feel is the only thing that grounds me now. It lets me know what happened was real as the scars on my hands. There was something else in the elevator with me that night, I'm certain of it. Something else spoke to the guard in that descending metal coffin. Something else beckoned to Stacy from the other side of the mirror. Things calmed down after that, for a while. My paranoia about reflective surfaces grew. It started small at first. Can you remember every single waking moment from yesterday? How about the day before that? Last week? Maybe it's that time your coworker said he thought he saw you leaving the office, but you were still around. Or when your wife asks you to pick up milk as she passed you in the kitchen. Or the keys that mysteriously made their way from the coffee table to the dresser. You don't remember these little blank spaces in your life. You accept that things slip your mind, that you forget things, because the alternative is unthinkable. That there's something else that looks exactly like you out there. Something else with your face but grinning like it's just heard the funniest joke in the world. Something that's slowly slipping into your life, like the thin wedge of a blade into the shell of an oyster, just waiting for the right time to twist. There were a few times when I almost thought I saw it. Someone 10 paces away on a crowded escalator with strangely familiar hair, or a sliver of my favorite shirt vanishing around the corner. All this time, I learnt to avoid my own reflection, keeping my head down in the bathroom as I sped past the mirror, averting my gaze when I saw windows and other glass surfaces. Shaving by touch. I only saw the grinning man once more after that. Julie was out of town for a couple of days. Some conference or business trip. I held on to Julie's hand a little longer than I should have as she was checking in. The words fought to get past the lump in my throat. Don't go. There's something stalking our daughter. Something wearing my face. I felt like screaming it out to the entire terminal, but instead I watched Julie's plane taxi out onto the runway, with an unfamiliar longing in my chest. It was just Stacy and I in the house, but we were not alone. I'd taken a series of afternoons off throughout the week. I told the office that I'd be working flexi from home, off the VPN. It gave me more time to get Stacy from school, fix dinner, and watch over her schoolwork. The second day after Julie left, I drove up to Stacy's normal pickup location. It was empty. I circled around a few blocks. Still nothing. I remember thinking that she was probably talking to her friends, or grabbing a soda, or one of a million other things little girls got up to. I found a parking space and walked back to the school. My ears strained to pick up any hint of her voice over the cacophony of laughter, screams and chatter of the end of the school day. Nothing. She's always on time, a still small voice said at the back of my head. I ignored it. I made my way to the school office. Recognition bloomed on the face of the lady behind the counter. "Oh, it's you again. Did Stacy forget something?" The fear of the previous few weeks rushed back. The elevator. The grinning man in the mirror. It hit me like a bucket of ice-cold water. "It's my first time here today," I forced out through clenched teeth. Biting her lip in consternation, she beckoned me around the corner. She pointed to an open file on the table. "Isn't that your signature?" Stacy was sure it was you. She seemed really happy. She turned around and started tapping away at her computer. I picked up the file. The signature at the bottom of the release form was mine. So was the handwriting. "Family emergency," it said. I had no recollection of coming here or filling out that form. There was something else though, a slight smudge across the paper, like someone had taken a thumb to the drying ink and swiped it from left to right. "Is the footage of you signing Stacy out?" I looked up at the LCD screen numbly. There I was, in the same clothes, standing behind the counter. Except I was writing with my left hand. I'm right-handed. The thing in the video playback pauses. It lifted its head towards the camera. I saw a familiar grin on its lips. My knuckles were very white as I gripped the steering wheel. It was getting dark already. Initially, I felt nothing but a white-hot rage. Nothing could stop me from finding my daughter and freeing her with my own bare hands. For a second, I was every badass movie father in existence. Liam Neeson, Bruce Willis, Mel Gibson. And then rationality took over. I didn't know where she was. The police couldn't help. And even if I brought it to them, I was more likely to wind up in the nut house than to get my daughter back. The rage melted away until nothing was left but the sick feeling of fear in the pit of my stomach, fluttering about like a living thing. I pulled up to my driveway. The front door was unlocked. I looked down at the row of flower pots by the door, at the little ring of dirt beside the third pot, the spare key. It was already dark outside. I groped for the light switch by the door. Hollow clicks told me that the lights were out. Listless fingers of orange fluorescent light crept into the living room through the windows. The house was silent, save for the rasp of my breathing and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. I turned on the little LED light on my phone. The light hid more than it revealed. Shadows danced on the wall as the feeble glare of the LED swung across the room. Nothing. I stepped cautiously through the corridor. A stranger in my own shadowy home. A flicker of light came from under the door of the bathroom in the corridor. The quiet sound of sobbing escaped from under the door. It wasn't locked. The door opened to madness. Stacy was standing in the middle of the bathroom, head bowed, her hair dangling in front of her face in limp strands. Someone had covered the walls of the bathroom with mirrors. Big mirrors, tiny pocket-sized ones, the huge standing mirror from my bedroom. A single guttering candle flame lit the room. Stacy was shaking slightly. The candle flame danced with the draft of the opening door, and a million reflections shook with her. The sound of her sobbing echoed from the walls. It sounded deafening in the dead silence of the empty house. I put the phone down on the floor and stepped up behind her. I slowly placed my hands on her shoulders. "We have to go now," I whispered in her ear. She looked up at our reflections in the big mirror as I tugged her gently backwards into the corridor. Her face twisted in fear and hate, and she let out an ear-piercing shriek and began threshing in my arms. It took all of my strength to drag her out of the bathroom. I looked up just as we tumbled out of the bathroom. Stacy's face was crazed with terror. Tears covered her cheeks. A single string of snot trailed from her nose to her cheek. One more thing. It wasn't me in the mirror. The clothes were the same. The same sweat glistened in the candlelight, except for the big grin on its mouth. On one side of the glass, I was pulling my daughter through the door into the safety of the darkened corridor. The other side of the glass told a different story. On the other side of the glass, a grinning man was pulling a screaming child into the darkness. Stacy and I stumbled down the corridor and out through the front door. We wheezed as we sucked the cool night air into our lungs. She tugged at my hand, looking up at me with clear eyes. Her face was clean, not a trace of snot or tears. "I'm hungry, Dad. I don't think the mirror will bother us anymore. He has what he wants." I only stopped to lock up the front door before I led Stacy to the car. We had dinner at a little diner down the street. At least, Stacy ate. I watched her like a hawk, my stomach still churning from the events of that evening. Dessert was gone and she started doodling on a napkin with a pencil stub of a pencil while I sat there, pensive. When had she started writing with her left hand? "Stop making those faces," said Julie, exasperated. We were out at the park enjoying some of the last days of summer. I'd gotten a spanking new camera to take my mind off things. A second-hand Canon 600D to start out some serious photography. Stacy hasn't quite been the same since that incident. There's a space between us that hasn't been there before. Julie has already noticed it. I've seen the concern in her eyes, the slight tension in her lips when Stacy refuses to do things with her newfound stubbornness. Julie handed me the camera. "And stop giving me that creepy grin, you big goofball." She leaned in for a kiss that I didn't return. I hadn't been grinning, but the expression she described was at once familiar and alien to me. It had been weeks since I'd last seen it, staring back at me. Once in my bathroom and the second time over my daughter's threshing form in her bathroom. My hands were visibly shaking as I raised the camera to my face. My wife taking up her position with her arms around Stacy's shoulders. I closed my eyes, hoping to sear this picture into my brain. The fine black rubber of the viewfinder brushed my eyebrow. I slowly let the air out of my lungs as I cracked my right eyelid open. My wife stood there, just as I remembered from a second ago. But Stacy, my baby girl, her mouth was open. Oh God, she was screaming, just like she had when I dragged her out of the bathroom. I know what Stacy sees in her reflection now, just like I know the grinning man is always there for me, behind those cursed pieces of glass and silver. I know now that the reflection that night told the true story. What I brought out of the room was something else, and he still has my daughter, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter.
You can blame it on the alcohol, but that wouldn't make me feel any better. People drink every day without killing someone. Besides, if I'm really being honest here, I probably would have still killed him if I'd have been sober. You can blame it on my childhood too, something to do with my father not being around, or not sticking with school, or falling in with a troubled crowd. But that's not quite true either though, is it? Because I would have ended up even worse if I admired someone as selfish and unstable as my father. And if the kids I knew were trouble, then it's probably my fault for making them that way, so I wouldn't feel so alone. I guess that leaves the blame on me, where it belongs. I knew exactly what I was doing when I borrowed the money in the first place. Marky made it clear he'd taken the money from his father. He said the old man was too senile to notice though, which was fine with me, since I never had any intention of paying it back. I couldn't plan 6 months in the future, but even if I could, I didn't expect to still be alive when the bill came due. But the money burned fast, and I always woke up again no matter how much I drank. Until one day Marky comes banging at my door, demanding something I didn't have to give. I could have opened the door that night and begged his forgiveness. I could have sworn to get clean and told him about the jobs I considered, and made an incremental payment plan to get him his money. Sucker that he was. Marky probably would have believed me. He might have even loaned me more if I'd been sincere about it. 20 seconds ago, maybe longer, that's how long I held the hammer in my hand and thought about what I was going to do. More than enough time to change my mind before I opened the door. I wasn't even at all angry when I struck the first blow. I was only angry at myself, and somehow it seemed like I could pour all my anger out of me and into him until he was gone and I was whole again. Would it change your opinion of me if you knew I cried after? Doesn't matter. I'm not writing this for you to feel sorry for me. I would have turned myself over to the police or to God, but the police would sentence me without understanding, and God would understand too much while do nothing. The only person I felt like I needed to confess to was Marky's father. He deserved to know where his money had gone and why he wouldn't see his son again. If anyone had the right to judge me, it was him. I hardly recognized Mr. Methuselah when I tracked him down. He was a lot older than I remember him. Back in the day, he caught Marky and I trying to break into a car together, and he let us both have it with a belt. He hardly looked strong enough to lift his cane now, but I was still more afraid of him than ever. I was shaking from head to foot when he looked up and down at me, slowly, agonizingly, as if he was deciding my punishment before I'd even told him what I'd done. Before I knew it, I was on my knees, although I didn't know whether it was because my legs were not strong enough to stand it anymore, or to beg. "You're late," he told me. "Where have you been? I've been up waiting for you. Stop playing around and come in, Marky. I'll get your dinner back in the oven." His mind really must be slipping to mistake me for Marky. With those words, he passed judgment over me though. Now it was my turn to make a choice. I could break the old man's heart and tell him that his son wasn't coming home. Or I could play the part and bring Marky back to life. I let Mr. Methuselah feed me, and I stayed the evening with him. And the more he talked to me, the more convinced I was that I was doing the right thing in letting him believe. His mind hadn't completely gone. He really had noticed the money that Marky took from him, and while I couldn't apologize for what I had already done, I found solace in apologizing for all the things he blamed his son for. Over the course of the evening, I promised to make it up to him, to visit more often, and take him to the park to watch the ducks, and 100 other things besides. He marveled at Marky's sudden transformation and insisted I stay the night in the spare room. After I'd gone to bed, he brought me a glass of water and kissed me on the forehead and told me I was home. Lying in bed in the dark, I cried for a second time that night. I couldn't forget what I had done, but that knowledge made me try all the harder to be everything Marky should have been. Mr. Methuselah had lived alone since his wife had died 4 years ago, and he was overjoyed to have company again. He showed me all his old baseball trophies, and his eyes lit up with delight when I told him I forgot the stories and asked him to tell me again. He had a big cupboard full of early musicals, and we'd watch one together every night. For the first few nights, all I could think about was slipping out to get a drink, but every time I'd mention leaving, I'd see the empty look on his face and know it was my duty to stay. Before I knew it, I was going days at a time without even thinking about alcohol. Not long after, I worked at a pharmacy around the block and started making the old man's money back for him. It wasn't that hard to save up now that I wasn't drinking, and he was letting me stay rent-free. I honestly can't remember a time I was so happy. I thought that was how my life was going to be forever, until the night we received an unexpected visitor. It was around midnight when we heard a rustle of a key in the lock downstairs. I got a flashback to when I lived alone in an area that got break-ins all the time, and I crept out of bed and spotted a flashlight beam lancing around the living room. Part of me was afraid, but I knew I didn't deserve to be here if I couldn't protect what I'd come to care about. I waited until the flashlight turned towards the kitchen before I crept down. The intruder was facing away from me, and I'd lose my chance if I waited any longer. He might have had a weapon, but I had a bronze baseball bat trophy and an arm that had done this before. I used the sharper corner of the base and got a clean blow before the intruder could turn around. A man crumpled to the floor, dazed but not out cold. He started to crawl away, but I pinned him to the ground ready for another blow. It would have landed too if shock hadn't have stayed my hand. Marky was lying on the floor below me, looking just as surprised and angry to see me as I was to see him. His skull still looked slightly misshapen from where I pummeled him with a hammer, what felt like a lifetime ago. I told him he was dead if he made a sound, and he believed me. He wanted to know what I was doing there, but I still had him pinned, and he was the one who had to talk. Marky confessed that he'd recovered, but had been too afraid to return to his father without the money. He figured he could come back and steal again, then later blamed the second robbery if the father ever noticed what was missing. I then confessed what I had done, and that he wasn't welcome anymore. I told him he was rotten through and through and didn't deserve his father's love. He was angry, I was angry, and it was only a matter of time before one of us got loud enough to wake the old man. If he saw us together, he'd know I was an imposter for sure, and I wasn't willing to give up the life I'd found. It wasn't the alcohol after all. I'd proven that when I brought the metal statue down on Marky's head again, and not stopping until I was more careful this time, and made sure to finish the job, cleaning and disposing of everything properly. It didn't hurt me the same as it had the first time. Mr. Methusa hadn't lost a son after all, but I had gained a father.
This is a warning. My best friend tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. Now all that's left of me is a shell, a broken man. I'm sorry that there's so much of it to tell. I couldn't risk leaving anything out. All I need is for one of you to understand, and I've done my job. Owen was my pal. Maybe the best one if I had to rank them. One of the good guys. He didn't have many friends. We met in high school, drawn together by a mutual love of turn-based strategy games. Master of Orion, Heroes of Might and Magic. Owen was an absolute beast at those games. He had a queer talent for memorizing patterns, statistics, and maps. He'd devour games like a man possessed, teasing out exploits and secrets while the rest of us were still getting our asses handed to us by the AI. Even 5 years out of college, Owen remained thin as a rake, his eyes looking perpetually surprised through thick spectacles. Life happened to the rest of our little circle of friends. We went corporate, chased the dream, ran the rat race. We never kept in touch like we should have, other than meeting up every few months for a meal. I gathered that he worked at a bank somewhere, cruising along and meeting his targets without excelling. The last time I saw Owen was a little over 4 months ago. He had arranged to meet me at one of our favourite bars in a quiet part of town. At least, it used to be, until our jobs and the pressures of grown-up life just expanded and expanded, filling up my life like so much bubble wrap. I got to the bar first, or so I thought. I searched the crowd fruitlessly until my eyes focused on a lone figure in a scruffy coat sitting at the bar. I had to swallow a gasp as the man turned around. I hadn't seen Owen in the better part of a year, but he looked like he'd aged a dozen. He was thin before, but he was nothing more than skin and bones now. His cheeks were sunken in, unshaven, with a wispy beard framing his mouth. He smelled of sweat and grime and worse. One thing hadn't changed. His eyes still blazed with a fierce intelligence. He gestured at the seat next to him. When he spoke, the words came out in a rush. He'd found something, he said. He'd found a warning, scribbled in an old map he'd seen in a library. It pointed to a street somewhere in the city that he hadn't been able to find on modern maps, or even on Google Maps. He'd hunted the street down, he said, and found a back alley, a nameless lane between two buildings that shouldn't have been there. Intrigued, he'd gone back and found another 2 maps in the library with other warnings, in different handwriting from the first. The maps were published years apart, yet seemed to be warning readers away from similar nameless streets. Owen grew more animated as he spoke, gesturing wildly, a small crust of white spittle forming at the corner of his mouth. He'd found more of the lanes the maps warned about, cracks between buildings that shouldn't have been there, hidden alleys. I saw a familiar glint of obsession in his eyes. He'd found something special, a hidden system, and he wouldn't rest until he had laid bare its secrets. He stopped short, his eyes widening at something through the window, across the busy street. I turned around to see what had spooked him, but the throng of people at the bar and on the street blocked me. Hands shaking, he teased out a tattered map from his pocket. It was covered in his crabby writing, too small to make out by the light of the bar counter. He marked a spot and hurriedly folded up the map, which quickly disappeared into his pocket. It's big, something hidden. I've almost got all the places. I'm almost there. I can't move fast enough. I'll need something faster. So that's what he wanted. Just to borrow my car for the weekend. I gave him a look that was half pity and half derision. Pity for the friend I knew, and derision for the madman twitching before me. It wasn't the first time I'd let him drive my car, much less now since we'd drifted apart. I had no idea what had gotten into Owen, and I wasn't even sure that I'd get it back in one piece. In the end, his plaintive wheedling got the better of me, and I agreed to let him have my car for the weekend. I wish to God I hadn't. I didn't hear anything from Owen that Saturday, or the day after. He didn't pick up his mobile the entire night. I had to get a cab in on Monday morning, and planned to take my mounting frustration out on Owen after work. Friendship be damned. His antics seemed more like college hijinks than something an adult should be playing at. I checked my phone as I left my apartment. A text from Owen. Car at my place. I was wrong. Burn map. Leave nothing behind. Don't come after me. I was sufficiently creeped out by the message to leave work early. I hadn't been to Owen's apartment in years, but I still remembered the way. I saw my car parked out front, a cup of coffee in the cup holder, a huge map of the city, densely annotated, unfolded in the passenger seat. I made my way up the stairs. The door to his apartment was open. Owen wasn't inside. His mother was. Her face, crumpled with a grief that no parent should know. Owen's house was a wreck. His mental decline clearly reflected in his apartment. Maps, photographs, and sheets of paper, covered with a mixture of scrawling handwriting, covered every possible surface. Between gulping sobs, she explained how she'd just come back from the morgue to identify his body. He'd been in a pretty nasty hit-and-run accident the morning before. The cops said he must have been dragged for a distance. Facial identification was impossible. She only managed to identify him through his personal effects and a tattoo on his upper arm. Or at least, a tattoo that used to be on his upper arm. The accident had sheared a chunk of flesh right off him, and she had to identify pieces of her son's body laid out on the cold metal of a gurney. Owen's father and brother came by with the funeral director then. I excused myself, leaving the family to their grief. As his friend, I should have offered my help, but I needed to leave the house. Owen had been found on Sunday morning. I whipped out my phone to verify what I already knew. He'd texted me at 3 a.m. on Monday morning. My head was still spinning when I got into my car. The shock of Owen's sudden passing and the chill left by the text message this morning danced nauseatingly in my head. Was the fight in the bar all I had to remember him by? I unfolded the map. Owen's spidery writing covered almost every available space on the map. He'd been writing with a force and speed which turned his usually neat script into an illegible scroll. So forceful in places that the cheap ballpoint pen had punched through the paper. He'd marked out dozens of locations on the map with crude stars, accompanied by annotated times and dates. The rest of the text made no sense. There were scribbled symbols that didn't even match any language that I knew of. The snatches of English that I could decipher made no more sense than the symbols, products of Owen's obviously addled mind. They watch from the cracks, nameless streets, secret kings and queens of the city. They sing to the dead, they eat the lost. The meaningless text still sent a chill down my spine. The depths of my friend's madness shocked me. I couldn't fathom why he would ask me to destroy the map. Lost in my troubled thoughts, I started my car. A polite chime snapped me back from my reverie. It came from a shiny black slab on my dashboard. A GPS unit. Not mine. Owen's. A strange thing for him to own since he didn't have a car to start with. I looked at the tiny LCD screen. I was at a location that Owen had marked out on his little GPS unit. His home? No, it was slightly off. Across the street. It looked to be in the middle of a building. A shop, maybe? The streets were empty of both pedestrians as well as cars. It was a quiet street, but something felt out of place. No, the street wasn't totally empty. There was a small lane, practically a crack between two buildings, right next to my car. A waifishly thin teenage girl was standing there, dressed in tatty jeans and a plain, threadbare t-shirt. Far too thin for the icy winter weather. No shoes either. She was wearing a look of intense focus on her face, her dark, piercing eyes staring upwards towards Owen's apartment. Her face was perfectly formed, pale but covered in streaks of dirt. Her blonde hair, matted into crude dreadlocks. She seemed perfectly at ease in the cold, as though she could feel my eyes on her. Her head snapped downwards, and she affixed me with her mesmerizing gaze. I felt transfixed, like a butterfly pinned to a corkboard. Her bright pink tongue snaked out from between her dirty lips. The pointy tip ran across her lips in anticipation. I looked back at the GPS unit. There shouldn't have been an alley where she was standing. It should have been a continuous block of buildings. When I looked up, she was gone again. Unnerved by the nameless lane and the vanishing girl, I drove off a little faster than I should have. I must have driven at least 5 blocks when I heard the little chime from my dashboard again. Another star on the map. Same thing, a star where there shouldn't have been a break between buildings. I nearly slammed on the brakes in shock when I saw the girl again. There was no way she could have made the distance between my last stop and this one on foot. I racked my brains for a logical explanation as my car cruised by. A sister? Or did she have a car in a parallel street? I found her giving me that same intense look. It had to be the same girl. It was the look, that hungry look. She craned her neck to follow my car as I drove by, like a snake staring a mouse down. I watched her shrinking into the rearview mirror for as long as I could. Then I floored the accelerator, trying to get as far from her as possible. Rubber squealed on the black asphalt. I'd put about 7 blocks between the girl and I when the polite chime from my dashboard sounded again. Adrenaline pumped through my system. My gaze swept across the empty streets. There she was again. It had to be the same girl. It had to be. She caught my gaze with her own piercing look, and she smiled at me. No, it wasn't a smile. She pulled her lips up and back and bared her straight white teeth, but there was neither humor nor warmth in the expression. It put me in mind of a baboon or a wolf, facing down something small and helpless, baring her fangs, I thought. She abruptly turned and scuttled down that almost hidden alley. I stopped the car. Owen had found something. I hadn't done right by him in his last days, but I had to know how he died. I owed him that much. I rounded the corner mere seconds after the girl. The alley was empty. Rough cement walls stretched to the sky, blocking out the tired light of the evening sun. She had vanished in the scant seconds it took me to get to the mouth of the tiny, nameless alley. My pulse quickened as I made my way down the tight corridor. My walk turned into a trot, and the trot into a sprint. By the time I had reached the end of the street, my chest was heaving, constricted by bands of hot iron. My breath steamed in the cold evening air. She wasn't there. There weren't any alcoves or windows or turn-offs anywhere down the alley. I hit the end of the alley and peered down the adjacent street. No trace of the girl. No alleyways she could have turned down. No doors or windows she could have climbed through. Nothing except the empty street with a familiar car parked by the side of the road. My car. I had walked 100 yards through a straight alley and wound up back where I started. I felt the world spin around me. I put my hand on the wall to steady myself. What had Owen found? What was he searching for before he died? How was it possible for a straight alley to start and end in the same place? Large gouts of mist shot from my mouth as my chest heaved. There was something unnatural about this place, something wrong in the air. I felt strange grooves under my hand as I pushed on the wall to straighten up. Someone or something had carved a series of strange symbols on the wall. Now I know where Owen had gotten those scribbled hieroglyphics from. He'd seen them too. He must have been trying to decipher it like some code. Typical for him. I cast a final look straight down the strange empty alley. The girl was still nowhere to be seen. I felt the strangeness of the alley behind me as I made my way back to my car. My breath misted on the cold window as I cast one final look towards that crack between buildings, that nameless space. The nameless space with the same girl staring out at me. The temperature was close to freezing outside, but I finally realized what had unnerved me about that silent tableau. All that time I was staring at her. I hadn't seen her breath mist up on the crisp evening air. What I saw that day filled up my waking moments like a creeping itch. I would find my eyes magnetically drawn to the hard plastic shell of my glove compartment on the slow commute to work. Owen's mysterious map and GPS navigator skittered around within their prison like caged rats when I took turns just a little too hard, reminding me of their presence. Owen had stumbled onto something strange. He'd found something and it had consumed him. I'd gone to the funeral with the expressed intention of handing over the map and the navigator to Owen's family. The empty rows in the church showed just how far he'd taken his search. No colleagues, barely any friends. The odd family member. He'd lost his job months ago, cut off almost all contact with the outside world. Owen's mum had aged a decade since I saw her last. The raw shock of hearing about her son's death replaced with a bone-deep sorrow, painfully obvious in the crinkles in the corners of her eyes, in her sunken cheeks, in her haunted, leaking eyes. I'd whispered my commiserations, saying how sorry I was, all while the truth of the map and Owen's last warning poised at the back of my throat like a wave of bile. I choked the secrets back, where they sat in my gut, swollen and sour. I had to find out more. I spent hours trying to decipher Owen's writing, looking for a pattern in the crazed scribblings. I lacked Owen's skill with codes and systems. There was no pattern I could discern from the constellation of marked locations. No hidden message leapt out from his ravings. There was only one other thing to try. The day was cold, I remember, even for midwinter. Not a skin cold, the cold that cut through your clothes, seeped in with every breath into your lungs. A deep, bone cold. I returned to the first 3 alleys where I'd seen the girl. I found nothing. The alleys were totally empty. In stark contrast to the busy streets just a few yards away. The 4th one was empty too. It was getting dark by the time I got to the 5th point marked on the map. The crowd on the sidewalks had thinned out as the chill got deeper. Owen's handwriting was impossible to read in the weakening light. I rounded the corner and I saw another one. He could have been a brother or twin to the girl I'd seen. Same blonde hair, a simple fitted t-shirt, jeans, barefoot on the biting cold concrete. He gave me a sardonic stare. He looked to be gnawing at something, a chicken wing or something similar, with great gusto. I saw as he stretched his mouth open to suck the last ounce of flavour off the little morsel, before drawing out the bleached bone from his mouth and flinging it into the distance. He made a little mew, as though he'd bitten into something sour. His eyes still locked with mine, he opened his mouth and rooted around with a questing finger. Finding what he'd been looking for, he hooked out a huge-looking greyish chunk out of his mouth and delicately set it on the floor. Abruptly, he turned took 3 deliberate steps to his right and vanished around a turn. I rushed forward to see what he had put on the floor. I wished I hadn't. It was a ring, class of 06, still slicked wet with saliva on the outside, but sticky red with blood and shreds of tissue on the inside. I instinctively clutched at the identical ring I wore on my index finger. The boy hadn't been chewing on any buffalo wing. He'd been chewing on Owen's finger. The smell of blood hit my nose, sharp and rich, through the evening chill. My last meal rushed out of me in a flood, and sat, hot and steaming on the cold floor. I turned to face the small nook the boy had walked into. Nothing. Like the girl, he'd vanished. All that lay before me was a featureless dead end. Not featureless. Something that nobody else could have seen. Nobody but Owen and me. There, in the delicate spiderweb of cracks on the concrete, drawn out in a thin black filigree on the wall, was another of the symbols from Owen's map. When does a search become an obsession? Or when does an obsession burst into mania? Owen's degeneration was clear as day to me, but my own descent was far more subtle. The terrible damage of the accident had visited one final indignity on Owen and his kin. They had to say goodbye to the polished wooden veneer of a closed coffin. Had it really been my dear friend in that box? There must have been a few hundred of those rings pressed out. It could have belonged to anyone in my graduating year. Yet, I knew deep inside of me that it had to be Owen's ring I had picked up off the cold cement, wet with spit and blood. My search began in earnest then, to seek out what he had found, hoping beyond reason that I would find my old friend somewhere along that path. It started innocently enough. I'd spend a free evening after work wandering the streets, following Owen's map, each location like another morsel on a trail of breadcrumbs. The trail of clues was maddening. Again, I got the sense of a deeper pattern behind the randomness, and cursed myself for being unable to see it. Each site I visited seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle. I grew adept in finding the hidden symbols that Owen had found in the cracks in the city. I'd already found the first symbols scrolled into the wall in chalk when I'd seen the girl. Another hidden in a network of cracks in the wall after I found Owen's ring on the floor. Those weren't the last. I found another set of 3 symbols, hidden within spray-painted tags on a wall. One more in the carefully arranged guts of a dead rat. Its bowels burst and scattered over the floor. Another woven into the silken threads of a spiderweb, stretched between grey concrete and a rusty dumpster. Those hidden lanes and alleyways were always deserted. It could have been lunch hour or rush hour, with the streets thronging with people, and they would still be empty. I'd walk down those plain, blank concrete canyons for hour after hour, always feeling watched, never feeling alone. I never saw another living soul in those lanes and alleys during my search, but the hairs on the back of my neck would rise once I stepped into one. There was a sense of something deeply wrong, wholly unnatural, about those empty spaces. The sudden silence would envelop me, like a cocoon. The rush of voices and vehicles, coming from a world away. Faint like the tinny broadcast of a distant radio station. The isolation was palpable. With the isolation came a crawling fear, a watery feeling in my guts and my legs, that something or somebody was observing me, leading me on in my search. I never saw another living soul in those lonesome places, until I started seeing them again. The glances were always fleeting, titillating, a glimpse of a person turning into one of those cracks in the city, seconds before I rounded the corner, only to find myself alone in an empty alley. Or a set of footprints leading from a puddle, imprints of bare feet, like those of the boy and the girl, vanishing into the distance as the cold, dry air drank the moisture off the trail. A recently toppled trash can, still rolling on the floor, without any breeze to push it. I'm sure I saw the girl once again, the blonde one. Another girl with her dirty brown hair cut short. The boy I saw several times, always in the distance, always fleeing from me. I'm sure there were more. My search intensified. I took time off work to visit the cracks repeatedly. The symbols practically leapt out at me from the walls and floors, screaming to be read, deciphered. My experience with the first crack never repeated itself, but it was hardly the last oddity I experienced in the cracks. Once, near midnight, I found a crack that stretched for a full city block on the map. Yet, I could only count 76 paces from entrance to exit. Against all rationality, it measured 76 yards within the crack, but 100 yards on all parallel routes. On yet another day, I went into one of the cracks, scanning the walls for more of those symbols. When I emerged, blinking at the sudden brightness, 3 blocks down from where I'd entered. How could a straight path have deposited me anywhere but directly opposite where I'd gone in? By this point, my search started taking its toll. I'd gone beyond the point of worrying my friends. My phone, once a source of tweets, Facebook updates, and text messages, slowly went silent. My boss had called me in and told me that he was letting me go. My job would still be waiting for me if I applied again. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked me in the eye. "I like you," he said. "You've been a great worker, smart and fast. I don't know what kind of thing you've been going through for the past couple of weeks, but you're not contributing anymore, and I can't afford to keep you on at the state you're in now." I mumbled something vague about things being bad at home. I was too wrapped up in my obsession to care by that point. I'd gone beyond visiting and revisiting the same sites marked on Owen's map. The week before, I'd found a crack that wasn't on his map, something new. Owen hadn't found them all. I could almost sense the shape of things, some pattern in the layout of cracks, some waiting breakthrough in the symbols. That's when I found him. I found myself with a lot more time. My search expanded. I found 2 more cracks, greedily documenting their locations and taking pictures of all the symbols I could find. And then I found my 4th one. The sun was high overhead, but the light provided no warmth. Like a morgue, I remember thinking, all bright and cold. I rounded a corner on a busy street downtown. My breath caught in my throat. I felt the familiar tingle. I'd found another one. My heart leapt. But there was something else here. A few yards in, hunched over, was a man, a denizen of the streets from the looks of it. His tattered jacket wrapped tightly around his slight frame to keep out the biting cold. A dirty hand poked out from his jacket, holding the zipperless front together. I just saw 2 fingers clutching the dirty material. Some terrible damage had been wrought on his hand. A bandage, gummy with dried blood and pus, covered the rest of it. I rushed forward to speak to him. The first other real person I'd seen in my search. He perked up at the sound of my footsteps. His rheumy eyes widened when he saw me. The man raised a sheet of cardboard, crudely torn from some carton or box. I'd expected to see something routine, a plea for spare change, something about being willing to work, maybe even something witty. Instead, scrawled in large, blocky letters, 4 words: Run. They hunt you. The rough strokes of the letters were too broad to have come from a Sharpie or a marker pen. The ink was a rusty smear of brown, too spread out to have come from a normal writing instrument. Blood. The man had written the warning in blood. Who? I formed the question with my lips, even as the answer rang in my mind, clear as a bell. Owen's voice. The kings and the queens of the city. In that moment, my eyes locked with the clear blue eyes of the wreck of a man in front of me, and the dawning realization hit me like a freight train. Owen. Sweet God in heaven, I was looking at Owen. He'd known it was me all along, of course, but he hadn't expected the look of recognition on my face. He opened his mouth and moaned, a wordless sound of pure anguish. His mouth wide enough for me to see, the black stump flapping around inside like a dying fish. The shock of recognition was too much for me. My knees buckled as I backpedaled away from the ruinous vision in front of me. I went over backwards. The impact drove the air from my lungs. The world flashed white as my head met the floor with a crack. I got to my knees, wincing in pain. Owen wasn't there in front of me. I raised my head. The pain felt like a tent spike between my ears. Owen was standing a few feet from me, but he wasn't alone. The blonde girl was standing next to him, dwarfed by Owen's gangly frame. She held his hand delicately, like a nurse leading someone old and infirm. Owen's entire demeanor had changed. Moments before, he had worn an expression of shock and anguish. All that had melted away, and there was nothing but naked fear in his eyes. He shook gently as the girl raised his ruined hand to her lips, planting a kiss on the rotten bandage over his missing fingers. Not a kiss. I saw her lips work up and down as she sucked hungrily. When she looked up, there was a smear of brown over the perfect pink bow of her lips. We're coming for you next. There is so little of this one left, and there are so many of us. Her voice was clear and sharp, with just a trace of girlishness. She reached up and stroked Owen's cheek softly, smiling at me. Owen shuddered. The crotch of his jeans darkened as he lost control of his bladder. I tried to get to my feet, but the pain was blinding. The rush of blood to my head whited out my vision again. I blinked furiously, trying to clear my sight. When the world swam back into focus, Owen and the girl were gone. I rushed forward to the spot where I'd seen him last. Nothing lingered but the faint smell of piss and fear. Like the first time I stepped into one of these cracks, a long, straight concrete canyon stretched out before me. No traces of Owen or the girl. Then, the screaming started. The same sound that Owen had made earlier. The sound of pure pain and anguish, torn straight from his soul. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. I spun around like a madman, hoping to catch one last glimpse of my friend. He wasn't there. I put my hand against the wall to steady myself. I snapped my hand back. The wall was vibrating, humming. The screams were coming from the walls. I ran. The streets had emptied out for the evening. I'd lost track of where I was, how far I'd run. I felt like a man coming up for air, surfacing from the depths of a waking dream. A stranger looked back at me from the glass facades of the shops I walked past. An eternity ago, I was young, full of life and successful. Owen was the vagabond, the kook, the madman. Now, we were the same, he and I. Disheveled, unshaven, with one difference. I was afraid now. Afraid of what I'd become, of how far I'd fallen. Afraid of what I'd been chasing, not knowing that I was being hunted with a greater hunger than I was capable of imagining. I swallowed a little scream as I saw a pale face watching me in the reflection. I peeked over my shoulder. A young man stared out at me from an alley. One of them. The alley was dark. The scant street lighting made it seem like he was floating in shadow. He beamed widely at me, his teeth white and perfect, and stepped backwards. The darkness swallowed him. My pace quickened. Another alley, another crack. 2 of them this time, staring out from across the street, their eyes bright with mirth and longing. Is that what Owen saw that night in the bar? Was he being hunted too? I broke into a slow jog, and then into a flat-out sprint as the fear took root and grew. Owen was dead now, I was sure of it. I had squandered his first warning, and I feared that his second warning had come too late. I had to get home, destroy the maps like Owen said, stay away from the cracks, maybe leave town. There was nothing left here for me anyway. Only one more thing to do, and I've just done it. Like the map Owen found, or the last text he sent me, or even his last message to me written in his own blood. I've burnt the map, deleted all my photos, thrown out the GPS unit, destroyed anything that hints at where the cracks are. There are dark things in our cities, hidden things, hungry things, lurking in the web of cracks like spiders, waiting for the unwitting and the unprepared. All I need to do now is leave my story, my warning, and my hope that nobody else follows me or sees what I've seen. I am done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done.
Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, be sure to let me know. Let Papa Scare know by subscribing to him. He's an awesome narrator and guy, and I'd like to extend him and the authors of these stories a thank you for allowing me to use them and for working with me on this. I am trying to do just a few more creepypasta stories. I don't have many left, but I've wanted to do some for a while, and the ones I'm picking, I think at least, are really, really good. So like I said at the start, please subscribe to Papa Scare, show him some love, he is awesome, and it would really mean a lot to me if we could hit 1,000 subs on his channel, because I really think he deserves it, and you'll probably enjoy the videos he produces. I mean, I do. His voice is excellent. But with that being said, I'm going to leave you here. There's a link on screen to his channel and his latest video, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Stay awesome though, and I'll see you in the next one.